So this is the anti-war movement book that is in all those museums that I read from in the previous episode. And there are several more. I only read, I think, 3 of them. This is number 4, after Bush's speech. 1:28 until 3:20 in the morning. I wanted everybody to walk into work and hear this, you know? It was dawn in South Asia when the U.S. president finished his public intimation of violent global U.S. military action against terrorism that included commentary on the purpose and the workings of Allah, though he knows nothing of the Quran and cannot read or speak Arabic languages. The U.S. president claims the practice of Christianity, Methodist, by attending church services and functions, but little is known of his theology. As George W. Bush finished speaking, thousands of young men and women arrived in destinations in West Asia, deployed there during a week when U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and others said loudly and publicly that the U.S. government wants to infiltrate the Islamic world with spy personnel and attempt to better our military intelligence. Here in New York, young faces in uniform have a totally different meaning as we slowly come to grips with the fact that we have lost hundreds of extremely valuable and experienced firemen and police officers from the ranks because of the way they had to engage with the urgent, never-before-seen crisis at hand. We numbly watch younger men and women in positions of responsibility normally filled by an elder who is now dead. And we observe silently as other elders seek their sons and daughters, finding in some cases evidence of their death and in other cases none. The idea of sending young people in uniform into any place where they are not equipped to handle what will happen to them saddens the anti-war movement to tears. Though there has been no due process of law to justify our actions, the U.S. President thinks it wise to mobilize our forces in faraway territory. This strikes the anti-war movement as wholly stupid decision-making. It is the position of the anti-war movement that the people who committed the murders and other numerous crimes against United and American Airlines, the World Trade Centers, Lower Manhattan, Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the Pentagon, the state of Pennsylvania, and the United States were killed in the fiery explosions they visited so horrifically upon the U.S. It is impossible to hunt them down and do anything to them. They, like our friends, relatives, and fellow citizens killed by them, are dead. It is the position of the anti-war movement that the United States President and Congress are acting rashly and without sound judgment, that proper protocol is not being followed, and that more innocent lives are in jeopardy now than before the U.S. military was mobilized as a result of overly aggressive reactionary thinking on the part of U.S. politicians and sensationalism by U.S. media. Again, the anti-war movement calls upon the Supreme Court to take action to stop U.S. military action without due process of law. Now it's Monday, the 24th. So much has changed in the American society. And I'm 34 years old. I grew up here. I'm so sad. This is Monday, 13 days after the attacks from the Balas Agency to all AWM number 5. For the last 15 years, writers and producers of entertainment in the United States have exploited the military-industrial complex to create profit by enjoining entertainment with combat tools of the contemporary era. There has been tacit assistance from the United States defense industry in the endorsement and propagation of weapons of mass destruction, of which the U.S. industry is the world's leading producer. In effect, this has been the production of ads for arms. Every possible war game scenario that has been conceived by the military for purposes of security has been creatively described by Hollywood in Los Angeles and by the world's largest publishing industry in New York. The modes of communication at our disposal for disseminating information range widely, from the immediate and continuously active cell phones, the internet, surveillance equipment, to the hyper-produced entertainment coverage and news media. This is 13 days after the attacks, okay? Initially, coverage and exposure of the events of 11 September 01 consisted of intensely direct display of death and disfiguration of our citizens and cityscape, of vague speculation about the specifics of the crimes being committed and the perpetrators of those crimes. Then coverage became a tool for the government to call for violent retaliation, specifically against Muslim fundamentalists, Al-Qaeda, and Osama bin Laden, while shielding details of its intelligence gathering and evidence. Finally, the overwhelming majority of coverage became dedicated to grief and psychic recovery, with a drumbeat sales pitch for war tacked on. As the days pass, significant intelligence remains kept from the public, with the government now using the media outlets, public and private, to convey that it intends to lie to the citizenry and omit critical information in order to conduct its campaign for what it calls justice in this matter. This is cause for tremendous concern. We ought to actively slow the war machine to a stop and review the evidence that has been yielded for our consumption. We live amidst the greatest media manipulation in the continuum of mass media. After the initial wildness of a free press, data and information about what exactly happened between 0700 and 1100 EDT US on that fateful Tuesday has been carefully and roundly controlled in release. Due process, it could be argued, demands this, but more often the argument for classifying information is national security, and the justification is now for a military mobilization and engagement in West Asia that is unrelated to evidence against perpetrators of the crimes of 11 September. This morning, the U.S. President looked bluntly at reporters in the Rose Garden in defending his military plans. Quote, "Those of you trying to find a legal peg," he said vindictively, "Osama bin Laden's already been indicted." Close quote. But he didn't respond to the obvious fact that the indictment has been for other terrorist acts than those perpetrated on 11 September on U.S. soil. The two documents the administration intends to release later this week, one public and one secret, will presumably also be related to previous terrorist activity and not the events at hand. Now the government sells the idea of violence more directly. Fiction is unnecessary as a filter to push it. Bloodlust is easy to encourage through live, contemporary media. At this stage, the U.S. media giants have aligned themselves with the pro-violence effort, and they aid the government in promoting its agenda. 89% approval is broadcast based on samples of people who are willing to be polled, and a collective has been created under the command of a despot from Texas, the scion of one of the wealthiest families in the world. The media assist to create the idea of unity by promoting images that imply that factionalism has been superficially and profoundly ameliorated by the need to come together in a time of crisis. However, democratic processes have been interrupted, and the economy has been deeply scarred. The despot from Texas stubbornly refuses to acknowledge this, turning his pain into denial of all objectives but one: vengeance he names justice. We are subject to the will of the Bush family, just as the people of Iraq are subject to the will of Saddam Hussein when it comes to matters of war. We cannot control him. We can only watch as he, like his father before him, continues to make use of our public funds to wage a personal war with Muslims and the son of a wealthy family in another part of the world. A man whom no amount of demonizing and anti-propaganda can erase from photos showing him to be a one-time friend and ally to the Bush Empire, to Dick Cheney. The public mandate for the actions of the U.S. executive and legislative branches is suspect. I am confident that a growing number of younger, educated, intelligent minds do not approve of the archaic, barbaric, and militarily minded sensibility that drives the war machine at the head of our government. There is cause to wonder if a significant portion of our population who oppose war have been cowed into silence by the Bush administration and the media pitch. Further, to many people, it is obvious that the war effort is a transparent cover to let the U.S. military be used by wealthy figures. This is, again, 13 days after the attacks, okay? Further, to many people, it is obvious that the war effort is a transparent cover to let the U.S. military be used by wealthy figures of the world to protect their property and wealth. Many people in the U.S. resent the use of tax-funded operations being dedicated to the protection of a small percentage of the world's population, the friends and allies of the U.S. president and his corporate interests. We live in fear of recrimination for our ideas and shake with terror at the possibility that speaking up now will result in actions of violence against us. We pray at night for the madness to stop, for an end to the arrogant bullying by those who feel they must preen and flex their muscle to their neighbors. We live with the knowledge that violence begets violence, and an ever-cycling escalation of it inevitably results in terror, brutality, and barbarism. We are not in favor of the United States military being made to police the world on the basis of the moral code of the pseudo-Methodist president who leads them, nor the invisible Christian fundamentalist hand that seeks to rid the world of non-Christians or convert everyone alive. But what are we to do? Capitalistic profiteering urges the war metaphor on many fronts. Money is being made on selling violent thought. The United States is deeply divided, not united, and a powerful collective of like-minded thinkers dominate Congress and the White House, the Supreme Court, and many parts of the intellectual community. These like-minded thinkers seriously accept that the events that occupied the attention of the world on 11 September are some kind of justification for more violence to be visited upon the human race, for more aggressive behavior, not less. Further, these thinkers presume a police state into being, from which to impose their vision of this violent ethic upon the rest of humanity, because they have fought and believe won wars in the past. Many millions of people are capable of controlling their rage and anger, and have had the collective intelligence to develop a philosophy that promotes never hurting anyone else again ever. These people, as always, stand by in fear, and are shot down over and again as bystanders, innocents. We are held under the heel of the boot of the most highly organized and powerful military in all of human history. Rogue militants show no restraint in the use of weapons made and sold on all markets. Monks, ministers, rabbis, priests, humanists, and neutral parties are as yet ineffective at taming the bellicose nature of humankind. The old men are revivifying war, and the murder of innocents, and young rogues taught to fight run suicide raids on the obese, ugly superpower. We mourned, as is our tradition, for 12 days. We marked a 12th day ceremony for the several thousand souls who have passed unjustly. The psychic toll is overwhelming. The public display of grief has been organized to monumental levels. Multi-denominational, interfaith religious services were observed in Yankee Stadium and around the world. It has been truly one of the most remarkable 12-day periods in the history of the modern city. But by advocating war in any form, we cheapen and underestimate the importance of the time at hand and the significance of the possibility for worldwide peace. War has thus far been averted, but several vocal sectors of society are calling for it. We mustn't. It is the time for journalists and citizens of courage who oppose violence to write and speak against the Bush administration without fear of recrimination as anti-patriots. Please help the anti-war movement. And then the 25th. And then there's one more. This one's got a lot of... This is Tuesday, 2 weeks after the attacks. which were on Tuesday the 11th, and this is Tuesday the 25th, from the Bless Agency to all. Friends, some confused, dazed, and deeply grief-stricken people are cheering for war. All the phone calls and emails are monitored. Do not become discouraged. War is not the answer. Resist. AWM number 6. The anti-war movement still has no evidence regarding who hijacked the planes on 11th September, and though the passengers, crew, and alleged suspects are dead and no black box evidence has been revealed, more than 500 people have been detained as material witnesses to the events of that day. On the basis of national security, these witnesses' files have been sealed, making it impossible for private citizens to know what these people witnessed in the affected areas, Boston, New York, D.C., Pennsylvania, California, on 11 September 01. There has still been no due process, no grand jury, and no charges have been filed. At least 3 witnesses in San Diego have been denied right to legal counsel. The anti-war movement demands that the United States Supreme Court and the United Nations intervene in the U.S. war effort immediately on the grounds that U.S. military action in this case has been justified by the U.S. Congress only if it relates to the events of 11 September 2001. Sealed documents must be delivered to the courts, and all intelligence gathering surrounding the criminal investigation must be subject to strict judicial review before any further military action is taken by the United States against any nation or people. Further, the anti-war movement considers detained material witnesses in the United States to be prisoners of war and demands their immediate release to the United Nations or full public disclosure of their files. In addition, because the anti-war movement cannot determine whether there have been civilian deaths or permanent infrastructural damages in Afghanistan, damage in lives for which the United States is liable in criminal or civil courts, the anti-war movement demands a ceasefire until UN observers can assess. The potential cost to the American taxpayer is staggering, and yet it continues in the middle of rising unemployment in the U.S. and a recessionary economy because, in 12 quick working days, without public referendum, the United States Congress authorized broad powers to the executive office to retaliate against the perpetrators of the crimes of 11 September. The executive office continues to act without revealing anything of the investigation into these crimes. That's illegal, unethical, and since it involves murder, immoral among most of the world's practicing spiritualists. The U.S. now stands as guilty of international war crime as the people who took down the World Trade Centers. No evidence has been presented justifying bombing or attacking Afghanistan. The world is in a state of high alert, and in New York and Washington, D.C., public transportation has been totally disrupted. There is partial martial law in effect, with armed National Guard on the bridges. The anti-war movement believes U.S. aggressions will lead to escalation of conflict. Non-violent options must be pursued. The anti-war movement number 6 concludes thus. The first year of the Bush administration is a complete and total foreign policy failure. Damage to relationships with China, West and South Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Bush administration's inability to negotiate diplomatically with people of other cultures is a powerful liability that has much of the world scared. The anti-war movement fears administration incompetence could take us into bio, chem, or nuclear war. The anti-war movement notes that the George W. Bush administration is an international disgrace that in less than 10 months has repeatedly invited worldwide conflict by baiting its personal enemies. The anti-war movement condemns Bush for using the world's soldiers to pick fights rather than pursue creative, nonviolent solutions. Finally, the anti-war movement accuses Bush administration of domestic policy collapse and massive failure of administration intelligence, leading to a significant damage and loss of life, suggesting the strong possibility of an administrative cover-up of investigation into the events of 11 September 2001 to advance the Bush agenda toward war in West Asia. That's the 5 documents. They're in many museums now. And then you have the poetry, which can be heard on the internet. But I found this disc, which I think might be the actual original disc. If you look here, you can see the... Sorry. Didn't mean for that to happen. Here's the page on the net where you could see all of the recordings. But this, I believe, is a disc of it. So we're going to make another recording with that on it. MTK September 11th material.